Compared to double that. So looking first at mulch, you can see here the yield in kilos per plant from the second growing season all the way through the 10th growing season. And while when we look at the graph at that scale, we don't see a tremendous effect, what we did find was that yield was 8 to 20% greater with weed mat than other mulches in most years of the study. What was interesting is that there was a cultivar mulch interaction with no effect of mulch on cumulative yield in Duke, but in Liberty, yield was 11% greater with weed mat than the other two mulches. It was useful for our growers to know that these three mulches had no effect on fruit quality, including firmness, Brix, berry weight, and fruiting season, which was a bit surprising. So when we look at the yard debris compost in particular, organic growers were interested in using this because of its slow release nitrogen, as typical for a compost, releasing about a significant amount of the nitrogen that's put on through the growing season, particularly later in the growing season. And you can see here, when we calculate the volume of material we're applying and add that over the 10-year study, there's a phenomenal amount of potential nitrogen available with yard debris compost. Also phosphorus and potassium, which are typically high in yard and animal debris composts. We also had quite a bit of calcium in this particular compost, which was commonly used at the time. And that led to that compost in particular having a high pH. Now, despite that, we put that yard debris compost on top, and soil pH stayed within the acceptable range for blueberry throughout the entire study. So that's a good thing because we didn't have any confounding effects of mulch on pH. But because that yard debris compost had high available potassium, we did see a significant effect of mulch on soil potassium, particularly high, significantly higher in the yard debris compost mulch, and lowest in the sawdust mulch. So when we look at the impact of the mulches on leaf tissue potassium, this is leaf tissue potassium with fertilizer on the x-axis. We have sawdust is the orange bar, yard debris compost topped with sawdust is the blue, and weed mat is the black. And you can see that pretty much for every fertilizer treatment, we have higher leaf potassium with the, maybe the easiest way to say it is we have significantly lower leaf potassium with sawdust than the other two mulches. So that higher soil potassium is available. We found a similar thing in Liberty, but Liberty had significantly lower leaf potassium than Duke. What I want to point out here is how much higher leaf potassium was when we fertilized with fish compared to feather meal. This was true in both cultivars, but you can see particularly in Duke how high leaf potassium is when we fertilized with the higher rate of fish. Now, when we look at the two fertilizer sources that we have, fish emulsion and feather meal, both have potassium, but the potassium is much higher in the fish. Now remember, these organic growers typically are choosing a nitrogen source, and there certainly are fewer options available that don't have phosphorus and potassium. And so they might be applying these nutrients regardless of whether they're needed in the production system. So we have fertilizer rate, as I mentioned there. So let's look at the graph here. We have yield per plant, and this is cumulative yield from the second growing season through the 10th. And Liberty is in the orange bars. And you can see that there are very few fertilizer source or rate effects in Liberty, no significant effect. And that was consistent every year. In contrast, Duke had a fertilizer source effect. Yield was significantly lower, 35% on average, when Duke was fertilized with fish as compared to feather meal as the source. And feather meal, as you can see in the picture, that's applied as a granular and has a slower rate of availability. It's only applied in a split application compared to weekly applications with fish, which is more available. Still, we found a lower yield with the fish. Also notice that the yield is higher at the low rate of nitrogen that's applied as compared to the high rate. Cheaper is better when you're growing things. Why might Duke be sensitive in particular to fish? Well, when we're applying the high rate in a given year, in addition to applying 134 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, we're also applying 50 kilos of potassium per hectare, even though the soil has sufficient potassium. So we were able to, with 240 research plots, we were able to do a correlation analysis between yield in kilograms per plant and leaf potassium. And in Duke, there was a negative relationship between yield and leaf potassium. The higher the leaf potassium, as you can see in the graph, the lower the yield. Whereas in Liberty, we found no consistent relationship between leaf potassium and yield. And this is pretty significant evidence as to why Duke is sensitive to fish in particular. So the conclusions of our study were that adding yard debris compost as an end source did not increase yield. So the plants had sufficient nitrogen available in the system, even with our low rate of nitrogen. So adding yard debris compost wasn't a beneficial added nitrogen source in this particular study over the 10 years. But adding yard debris compost did increase soil potassium, as did fertilizing with fish. And this high soil potassium was negatively correlated with yield in Duke, but not Liberty. And high soil potassium also reduced leaf calcium and magnesium in both cultivars, which I didn't talk about here due to time. This sensitivity to potassium was confirmed by the negative effect of high potassium containing fertilizer source and rate on Duke. So, I wanted to point out here, let's see if I can go up. We found the highest yield at a leaf potassium of 0.42 to 0.55%. That's interesting because that's at the low end of our current recommended standards. So what we decided to do, and which is the project I'm talking about, funded by the Northwest Center, is we changed the mulch and fertilizer source to reduce weed management costs and mitigate, try to at least, like we're a grower would try to do, mitigate the high potassium issues. So starting in late winter 2017, we changed all to weed mat. And we put weed mat over top of any existing organic mulches. So what we ended up comparing was continuing to compare weed mat alone. So we replaced the weed mat over bare soil, placed new weed mat over the existing sawdust without replenishing it, and weed mat over the yard debris compost that was remaining and the sawdust. So now we're comparing weed mat over organic mulches. We also switched to a soybean-based fertilizer. Depending on the year, you can see the nitrogen concentration, but we adjusted the amount of product applied, fertigated, to apply what we call a moderate rate of nitrogen, 106 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So we collected results from 2017 through 2020. Yes, we were able to handpick fruit in 2020 using all the COVID safety procedures. We were very fortunate. So this slide shows yield in kilos per plant from 2016 through 2020. The arrow shows when the fertilizer and mulch were changed. So this is the last year of the original study. And you can see that yield increased for flat ground and raised beds for both Liberty in orange and Duke in blue. Now, yield was particularly low for Duke in 2017 because it was a really bad bird year for us. And the birds took quite a bit of our early season Duke fruit. So when we look at the percent yield increase, we found a relatively large increase in yield, even though we would technically call these plants mature in year 10. We still had large increases in yield in both cultivars. Now, in particular, when we look at changing mulch, we have the existing year where the mulches were separate. We continue to have black weed mat over bare soil is the black line. The blue line is weed mat over remaining yard debris compost and sawdust. And the orange line or yellow line is weed mat over sawdust. And we have this averaged over prior fertilizer use in cultivar. And we have flat ground and raised beds here. And you can see that we, particularly in flat ground, had a significantly lower yield in weed mat than the other two mulches in every year of the study. Continued to have a lower yield. And remember, in our prior study, weed mat had a significantly higher yield in Liberty compared to the organic mulches. Now we're finding that weed mat over bare soil is lower than weed mat over organic mulches. It less of an effect in raised beds, particularly towards the end of the study. And these are large increases in yield when you compare weed mat alone, weed mat over bare for raised and flat, compared to much higher increases in yield when we have weed mat over the organic mulches. So what might be going on? So if we look at soil organic matter in particular, in 2020 here, each year of the study, we've had a significantly lower soil organic matter when we have weed mat over bare soil. And that is potentially getting low to the point where it's reducing yield, or that's certainly the hypothesis. We still had significantly higher soil potassium when we had yard debris remaining in the system with weed mat over top. We had it in 3 of the 4 years. And when we look at historic fertilizer use, remember we stopped using high potassium fish in 2016. Feather meal has very little potassium. And when we stopped and switched to a non-potassium fertilizer, we found a relatively rapid decrease in soil potassium related to fertilizer, but we're still seeing significantly higher. It's taking a while. Still seeing significantly higher soil potassium with fish than with feather in general. Leaf potassium declined pretty rapidly when we switched to the weed mat and to soybean-based fertilizers. A pretty big drop, stayed relatively stable over the last few years. And when we did a correlation analysis comparing leaf potassium and yield, we still are finding a negative correlation between yield and leaf potassium, flat ground, and raised beds. So 2 of the 4 years in flat ground and all 4 years in raised beds. And notice that we still have our highest yield at that same kind of range from about 0.35 to 0.55. Lowest yield when we get above that level, confirming our earlier study still that we may not want to target higher leaf potassium. So the conclusions from this particular study is that yield increased even though the planting was mature, and that percent yield increase depended on prior management, which was interesting. Changing to a moderate rate of nitrogen compared to the prior low and high rate increased yield regardless of whether in the past they were fertilized with a low rate or a high rate. And so nitrogen, again, is not limiting. These plants do not need much nitrogen. Switching to soybean fertilizer, which did not have potassium, led to a decrease in soil and leaf K for both cultivars, and stopping use of compost also helped decrease soil potassium over time. We still found that leaf potassium was negatively correlated with yield, and placing weed mat over existing organic mulches in the row increased yield in both cultivars. So weed mat over bare soil decreases soil organic matter, and this has been shown in tree fruit. So when I established this trial in October 2006, I tried a treatment putting sawdust under weed mat for 10 different cultivars, and they all performed really well. So that led to the thought of starting a conventional trial where we compared sawdust alone to weed mat over sawdust. And again, weed mat over sawdust in establishing Duke looked really promising. It was actually a great treatment for both for weed management costs and for performance. So based on that information, plus what I just presented, for growers who have sawdust, switching and putting weed mat over your existing organic mulches could potentially increase yield. At least it looks promising based on our research. Again, I really want to caution conventional and organic growers to be very careful and not apply potassium when soil and plant levels are already good. I want to thank Amanda, who's the co-author on this presentation. I could not have made it through 2020 without her. She was in the field managing, collecting data on this trial, and that was amazing. So thank you for the support. And if there's time, I'll answer any questions. Stop sharing here.
Thanks, Bernadine. Looks like we've got one question for you.
Okay. One question. Let me have a look here. Why does potassium in the leaf influence yield? Very good question, Dr. Bushakra. I don't have, that's a great PhD project, by the way. It's possible there is a direct effect, but there could also be an indirect effect because although we didn't do it in this study or didn't present it in this particular study, in the prior study, leaf potassium also reduced uptake of leaf magnesium and calcium. So it is possible there's an indirect effect, although we didn't have as much power in the statistical power in the study I just presented to find many correlations between leaf potassium and other cations in the leaf. So what the mechanism is really interesting. I'm not sure, but it's clear that when there's higher soil potassium, the plants will take it up, and that's not necessarily a good thing.
It looks like we've got time for one more question. Bernadine, if you could address TJ's question.
Sure, I've got a couple questions here. Is the amount of ammoniacal nitrogen in soy fertilizer different than fish? I do not think so. I can go back because we had both fertilizers analyzed. They are very similar in their available nitrogen, and they were both fertigated. Why does organic matter mineralize so quickly under weed mat? Is it temperature related? Dead on, yes. We have documented that weed mat over bare soil increases soil temperature by about 9 degrees Fahrenheit, and that plus moisture is more than enough to break down organic matter and also to nitrify any ammoniacal fertilizers that you're applying.
Great, thanks so much, Bernadine. We are out of time, so thank you again for presenting, and I will transition you back to the conference. Okay, so next up for our first poster presentation, we have got Amanda Davis from Oregon State University. And as Amanda gets settled in, I just want to drop the link to our poster gallery for everybody in the chat. Give me 1 second. So if everybody follows that link, you'll be able to join the poster gallery online. In order to access all the posters, you do need to enter a password, which is poster 2020. So if anybody would like to follow along with Amanda's presentation in a larger screen, please do direct it to the poster gallery. So without further ado, I'll let you have the stage, Amanda.
All right, thank you. Can you see everything and hear me okay?
I can, and everything looks great.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks. I'm glad to be here today to share the very beginning of our study that we're working on in Columbia Star Blackberry. So we're looking at alternative management systems of this variety for improved machine harvested yield and quality. So I'm just going to be scrolling around this poster a little bit. This is the first time I've done a virtual poster session, but I think we'll make it work out. So the objective of our trial is to determine the impact of plant spacing, our pruning and training methods, and primocane management on plant growth, yield, fruit quality, and also labor requirements when we're machine harvesting Columbia Star for a processed market. So we planted this field. We're also collaborating with Dr. Dave Bryla with USDA, and he's going to be presenting a poster tomorrow about his portion of the field. But we planted this field originally last fall, the end of September. Right after planting, we did have a pretty hard frost, which damaged some of our plants. So we actually ended up replanting some of them this year. But at this point, they've all pretty much caught up, and we're really happy with the growth that we're seeing. So the treatments that we're going to be doing in this trial is looking at in-row spacing. So our traditional 5-foot spacing between plants and 10-foot spacing between rows versus a high density 2.5-foot plant spacing. We're looking at doing the typical August training where we remove the old dying floricanes in August and train the new primocanes up on the trellis versus the new over old system that a lot of blackberry growers are starting to use in order to save labor and costs there. So in that system, we won't be removing floricanes for several years at a time, and we'll just be weaving the primocanes into the canopy as they grow. And then the final treatments will be looking at primocane suppression. So we will, half the field will have the first flush of primocanes in the spring removed using chemical suppressants, and the rest will not have any primocanes removed. So we're going to be looking at all those treatment combinations. And the data that we're going to be collecting is looking at yield and fruit quality. So this is going to be machine harvested yield, how much fruit we're losing on the ground, what fruit needs to get culled out, any contaminants from plants or anything else that might get in there. Average berry weight, and then if there's any impacts of those treatments on our fruiting season. And then we'll also be looking at how our plants are growing and how healthy they are. So we're going to be measuring the primocane length at suppression, and then again at the end of the season when we're training them. And then we'll be looking at floricane biomass, length, things like bud break and fruits per lateral. And we'll also be able to assess any impacts of these treatments on cold injury, cane disease, and insect and disease presence. And you know, this year we know that we've seen some issues in grower fields with some cane diseases and cane blights in Columbia Star in particular. So I'm not sure if we'll have this field in the ground long enough for that really to become an issue here, but it's definitely something that we will be keeping an eye on since we're going to be doing this new over old, which can potentially increase disease pressure. So you can see on the left side of the screen, we've got some pictures that were taken at the end of October. The top picture is the 2.5-foot plant spacing, and you can see based on the shadows over here, how quickly those plants have filled in that canopy and just how close together they are. And that's compared to the 5-foot spacing in the bottom picture where there's a little bit more space between the plants still. But lots of good vigorous growth. The picture on the right side is sort of you can see most of the field in it. It's about 0.4 acres altogether between our trial and Dr. Bryla's trial. So we'll scroll back up a little bit. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is the labor and the economics of all these different types of systems. So we'll be keeping track of how many hours it takes to do these various management tasks and the cost required for those things, such as primocane training, the difference in plant cost, because obviously there's double the number of plants if we're going to that high density. And then we'll be coming up with a cost benefit analysis at the end of this trial. So far, these pictures across the top, this is from our planting date last fall. Again, similar plants were replanted this spring as needed. We got our trellis installed at the early part of June, did our first cane training at the early part of July. We were really fortunate to have 6 of our great returning students come and follow all the COVID safety protocols, and they really helped get us through the summer. So we're thankful for them. This is what the plants look like after training, and you can see just how much they grew over this summer. So we measured, just to get a baseline of where we're at, we measured the primocanes at the end of the growing season at the end of October, and found that in the 2.5 foot spacing, the plants had an average cane length of about 4.4 meters. And it was actually a little bit shorter at 4.1 meters for the 5 foot spacing at the end of the season. But again, nice, good plant growth. And we will be machine harvesting our first baby crop in the summer of 2021. And so next year I should have a lot more results to bring to you. So I'll be excited to share those at next year's meeting. And that's all I have. If anybody has any questions.
Thanks so much for presenting, Amanda. It's a great first poster presentation.
Thanks.
So if anybody would like to ask Amanda any questions about her poster, feel free to use the question and answer box.
Oh, I see.
And it looks like we got one. Go for it, Amanda.
Oh, it's just a question from Jill Rushakra. Will you contact me about presenting at NARBA? Sure, I will definitely contact you, Jill. Yeah.
Perfect.
That was an easy question. Thank you.
Okay, last call for questions. Okay, well, thank you so much for presenting, Amanda, and I will transition you back to the conference.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next up, we've got Michael Hartigan with the USDA, and he will also be presenting a poster presentation. Hi, Michael. Perfect, and you are still muted, so just remember to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Perfect.
Are you seeing my entire desktop, or are you just seeing?
Nope, I just see your PDF file.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
All right, so yeah, I'm gonna give an overview of the USDA breeding program, the activities we've been going through this year. You know, I started back in June, and I've had the great opportunity of working with Ted and Mary here in the program, but also Bernadine and you know, Dave Bryla and collaborators like Wendy at Washington State and Michael Dossett at AgriFood Canada. So it's been a really great opportunity. So I'm just going to go through some of the different crops that we're working on and just give a few updates. So for blackberry, you know, we've had Black Diamond and Columbia Star, which are fairly recent releases, but have been out for a little while now and have, you know, they've been selling well. There have been some potential disease susceptibility issues that I think a lot of people are aware of now that have arisen with Columbia Star and, you know, Virginia Stockwell and other people at HCRU here in Corvallis are following on that. As far as some of the other blackberries, the thornless semi-erects, so there have been 3 recent releases, Eclipse, Galaxy, and Twilight. And I think, you know, Chad had presented on those previously. So I think, you know, I'm going to focus on the 4th thornless semi-erect variety, this selection ORUS 4670-1, that will complement those existing 3. And we're really, really excited about this selection. It outperforms Chester Thornless in terms of yield and has much better flavor. And it's about 10 days earlier. And we have heard back actually, we've heard positive feedback about this one, including some people from the East Coast, some people in Virginia, and also we believe somebody, I think Gina Fernandez at NC State is also starting a trial involving 4670 and the other 3 thornless semi-erects. So we're excited to hear back about that as well. And we'll also be releasing our first primocane fruiting blackberry this year as well, selection 4999-2. It ripens earlier than any commercially available primocanes here now, and it has excellent fruit quality and yield, so we're excited about that as well. As far as raspberry goes, we're continuing to collaborate with Washington State and Agri-Food Canada on machine harvest trials with our materials and theirs. And we're also continuing with Bernadine Strick to do machine harvest trialing of red raspberries that include ours and Washington's at OSU NUREC here in Oregon. And we've identified some really, some selections out of the Washington program with really good performance and great machine harvested fruit quality that perform well in Oregon. And in addition, we're looking at releasing a red raspberry selection of primocane fruiter from the program as well. It's 4716-1. And it has great yield and it's easy to harvest. There's a trait that we're very interested in with this selection, and that's that it can be picked pre-ripe when it's still pink with very good flavor and quality. And that trait looks like it may be heritable based on what we're seeing in the program. So we're really interested in really digging into that trait for developing future populations. For blueberry, recently we had patented the variety Echo, which is a perpetual fruiting ornamental. The Mini Blues machine harvest trial is still at OSU NUREC right now, and Bernadine is a good person to talk to if you're interested in that trial. But we also have other selections we're interested in right now. 235-3 is earlier than Duke and has really amazing fruit quality and aroma. And 264-1 also has great performance. It's been one of our top performers. And we're just waiting to get more feedback from growers about this one before we, think about potentially releasing it. But Chad had written down that he, pending anything we hear back from growers that suggests there might be a problem with it, I think this is one that he was most likely going to move forward with. ORUS 120-1 is a rabbit eye that's looked good for us, and 587-1 is another high bush blueberry. And then for strawberries, we haven't made any crosses this year. Well, we didn't make crosses in any of the parts of the program this year, but we are still working on strawberry, and we made selections this year, and we'll be developing populations in the future. And finally, for black raspberry, so Mary and I have definitely marked some things to purge from the black raspberry trials after this year. The trials were really huge, and we're trying to reduce the number of individuals, but we're still developing these aphid-resistant black raspberry varieties. There's one selection we're planning to release as a variety right now as a replacement for Mac Black. It's very late. And there's another one that we're interested in. It's a purple black raspberry that actually has the thornless trait. And we're interested in that as a source for thornlessness within the black raspberry breeding program. So that covers everything. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Great, thank you for your presentation, Michael. So again, if anybody would like to ask Michael a question, please do use the question and answer box to get those questions to Michael. We'll allow about 2 to 3 minutes for questions here. Okay, Michael, looks like we've got one question. So I know it's best to see them if you stop screen sharing.
Oh, I can pull up the Q&A box in
Perfect.
parallel. So yeah, to that first question from Thomas Walters, yes, so the Washington state selections that did best in our Oregon trials were WSU 2130, 2088, and 2188. And most of the Washington, that's in terms of yield, productivity. Most of the Washington stuff, including those selections that we looked at, had great machine harvest fruit quality. It was, yeah, they performed very well at OSU New Rec. Ted, have we settled on names for any of the upcoming releases? We're considering, one of the names, so we took votes on a few of them. One that performed well for 4670-1, the thornless semi-erect blackberry, was Equinox. It's kind of in keeping with that cosmic or celestial theme of those thornless semi-erects that have some of that Eastern germplasm kind of hybridized into their background. So we may go with that, but nothing is totally settled on yet. Jill Bishakra, for the strawberries, do they pick without the cap? That's amazing. But does it compromise the shelf life? Let me see. So I actually probably could not answer that question off the top of my head yet. Let's see. My background in strawberry is coming from Davis, where we were not doing processing. So I would guess that, picking without the cap would affect processing or would affect shelf life. Let's see. Sorry, Jill. I'm not sure I answered your question too well there. I'm not totally sure. What's your feeling about Hull's Beauty? Is it an ornamental or is it commercial you pick? I'm not sure yet as far as Hull's Beauty for an ornamental, for the backyard grower versus a commercial you pick, but actually there was one thing that didn't make it onto this poster on that topic that I would like to note, which is that we are planning to release a trailing ornamental variety from the program, selection 4535-1, which is sort of a dwarf style trailer. It has shorter internode lengths and it's ornamental. It can be grown in a pot and has good fruit quality, good flavor, not great flavor, but definitely acceptable for ornamental purposes. Yeah, Jill, I think you make a good point there. I wish Chad were here so I could talk to him about it, but I know from working with Ted that capping was an important trait that was that Chad was taking notes on for the breeding program and for his selections. So yeah, I think he probably had accounted for that, in his selection index that he was using when he was developing these populations.
Great, Michael. I think that's all the questions we've got for you, and looks like we're out of time for you. So thank you again for presenting your poster presentation.
Yeah, no problem.
Looks like we might have one more. Jill just popped one in real quick.
Okay. Oh, thanks, Jill. That's good to know. I appreciate that. Appreciate that feedback.
Great. With that last one, Michael, I'll transition you back to the conference. So thank you again for presenting. Okay, thanks everyone for sticking around. I will go ahead and do our raffle prize giveaway. So let me just make sure our winner is on the line. Perfect. So again, big shout out to all of our conference sponsors for making our giveaway prizes possible this year. So for this session, we are giving away another $100 gift card to Compass Wines. And the winner for this one is Nella Bazil. And I apologize if I didn't pronounce your name correctly, but congratulations for winning this gift card. And I will be in contact with you the next few days to get your final details. So with that, thank you everyone for attending the conference for this morning. We will be doing our next session at 2 p.m.